Thank you all for being here. I think I have the prime time spot. 10 o'clock couldn't be any better to fill a room. So thanks for coming. I'm talking about it started as nature versus nurture. We're going to talk a lot about that. But then, of course, if you've ever had my class, you know that I tend to go off topic on occasion. So we're going to talk about all kinds of things today. And hopefully at the end, we're going to have time for some lively discussion, or at least some good discussion, and my students know that I expect them to participate for sure. So last night when I was trying to prepare this talk, I asked myself the question, how did I get myself into this position? And the answer was, as it usually is, I signed up for this. So I've had the opportunity to do a lot of different things, and often in research or extracurricular activities. If an opportunity comes up, I'll be the first person to volunteer, and I love to volunteer and help with different types of research. And so I sign up for these things, and it gives me opportunities not only to get experience, but to dabble in things that maybe I don't quite have a lot of experience in, and I can experience new things and get an idea on what's some different perspectives for me. And I also find that if I'm working with a new collaborator, it gives me new perspectives on not getting such a focused tunnel vision on my thoughts on a topic or how things work, but it helps me communicate with collaborators a little bit better as well. So I love collaborating, and I think that collaborations can be wonderfully synergistic. So I'm a big collaborator, so I do work with multiple species and as many people who will have me on a project. I participated in a lot of production studies, especially back in graduate school, but it was the stress and behavior studies that captured my attention back in grad school as well. I've done trailer stress and weaning stress with horses and pigs. I've done handling stress and stereotypic behavior projects with pigs and horses as well. I've also worked with anxious and aggressive dogs and anxious horses. And I think goats are neat as well. So goats are cool. When I started working on behavior, I was like most amateurs, and I assigned anthropomorphic motivations to many of my focus animals. In fact, all animals. And a lot of us do because we love our animals and it's more fun that way. But as I became more, understanding with animal physiology and behavior, those types of techniques had less and less use to me, and they weren't helpful in my research. And then that's when the debate of nature versus nurture really started to come into my life. So just some background for some of you who really maybe don't understand the whole debate of nature versus nurture, which is very old and probably in some of you kind of an obsolete, because we really don't fight over it so much anymore. Maybe some of us do, but not most of us. So those, it's just the debate of the influence of our genetics versus the influence of our environment on who we are or how we respond, or how productive we are, our fitness and survivability. But those of us who adopt extreme hereditary positions are known as nativists, and their basic assumptions is that characteristics of species or human species or as a whole is a product of evolution, and that the individual differences are due to a person's unique genetic code. And characteristics and differences that are not observable at birth, that maybe come out later in life, or during maturation, or switched on by certain biological triggering functions, And that's because our genetics are programmed that way. And then you have the group on the other end of the spectrum, and they're the environmentalists, and they believe that the environment is what shapes us as a whole, that really our genetics make our phenotype up, or phenotypic appearances up, and that we make from birth to, we're a blank slate, as you will, and whenever we experience things or have a traumatic experience or accident, then that's going to condition us perpetually. And so after we are born, that tabula rasa, or that blank slate, is going to be filled up as we experience life and continue on. Thus developing and reinforcing the behaviors that we will predict, or that we will exhibit. So you have genetics and physical attributes that nature may exhibit, and then there's such as your phenotype, like your eye color or your hair color if you don't dye it, and how tall you are. So and nurture, or your environmental influence, may be how good your nutrition is, or the amount of stress that you have in your life, and then of course, like I mentioned, the experiences that you have in your life. So memory, just so you know, and this may be a side note, and I talk to my students about this, I always want to teach them with a certain level of stress, because memory is tied to stress, and that helps you remember. So if you've ever missed a question on a test, and you've really upset about it, or you're embarrassed about it, do you ever forget it again? Probably not. I know I never do. Those are the ones I never forget. But you never see again on the test, unfortunately. So you have evidence that we use in scientific research for nature and nurture, biological approach, the biology of gender, the medical model, Valby's maternal deprivation hypothesis, which is that the bonding between a mother and offspring is strictly for survivability and not any other reason. We have classical conditioning, operant conditioning. Those in my ethology class kind of know the differences between those. Pavlov's dog, Skinner boxes, zapping them with negative reinforcement or stuff like that. Behaviorism, the social learning theory. Have you ever heard of the Bobo clown experiment, where we learn from observation? Have y'all ever heard of the Bobo clown experiment? Where they watch children will watch an adult go into a room with a Bobo clown and they beat them up, or they hug them and pet them, and then you leave the room with the kid in the room alone with the Bobo clown and watch what they do, and they will always model the adult's behavior. So that was done back in the 60s, so we kind of all understand that now, but it was really groundbreaking work back then to help us understand social learning theory and behavior. And then there's conformity, and we talk about conformity experiments all the time, and how tragically twisted they can be, and how the human behavior is so intent on, we always want to say that we will do the right thing, but how often human nature is to conform to higher authority and whatnot, and how hard it is for us to stand up for what we might think is right, or to stand up in the crowd and voice what we think is either outside the norm or the box, and like bullying or stuff like that right now is a big subject, and we have to advocate for it because it's so hard for us to get around it. So there are it's a graduation of approach, so there's differences. So most people agree that these are not mutually exclusive theories or concepts. But because the brain receives specific experiences and stimulus via different receptors and different pathways in the brain, measuring these interactions can be really difficult And any given genotype will develop differently under different environmental conditions, and that would be called what we call phenotypic plasticity. So whenever you have a particular genotype that can undergo or that can exhibit several different phenotypes, depending on the environment around it, the animal's going to either behave differently or look differently. One easy thing for you to wrap your head around if you don't understand behavior is like flamingos or cardinals, why in their environment that if they have a certain type of substrates in their food, they're going to look different colors, right? And so that would be like phenotypic plasticity. There's also a little bit harder for us to understand behavioral plasticity in this kind of the same kind of concept, how our behavior can be altered with our environment. And probably the best, most understanding way that you can understand is just being stressed out. So I think we all understand that. Here's a fun one too. So I always like to put this one in because it's a fun project to think about. So phenotypic plasticity and behavior. So there are critical periods in our developmental lives. Of course, we all understand that our brains are developing when we're young. And I had a student that had her 25th birthday, and we were just the other day, and we were all teasing her because her frontal cortex was just finally, you know, we celebrated her frontal cortex was finally developed, and she was done forever. So hopefully not, because we can still condition ourselves, I think. But as we are young, we are in certain critical periods of development, and that's a very sensitive time in interval in development when certain experiences are either critical or needed for us to, that we need for input for us to be able to develop either a particular skill or ability, or even in this particular instance like sight. So this is important to me as a scientist because I'm interested in stress and welfare in animals. And so if you have animals in captivity or in stressful situations and they are not experiencing normal behavior that maybe we don't even understand that they need to experience, we may be putting them at a disadvantage that could subject them to either stress, and stress leads to lack of production in production animals and wild animals and all of the above for production later, or just reproduction, or sociability, or just living a happy life. So the Kitten Carousel experiment demonstrates how early experiences affect our perception. And so what the experiment did is it allowed for one kitten to experience the environment in a very active manner. So they put them in this little carousel. And if you can see in the picture, one kitten was in a basket to where he could move around. He had activity of his legs, and the other kitten was at the mercy of the kitten with the activity. So he can move around, but only if the active kitten decided to. So they would move around in this basket. They couldn't see each other, so all they could see were vertical lines, black and white lines in this little room. And then they were, their visual experiences were identical. And then the carousel chamber, the carousel chamber was composed of black and white vertical stripes. They were kept in complete darkness when they weren't in the carousel chamber, but they were kept with their mothers because they ran some preliminary experiments that showed that when they separated them or isolated them from their mothers, they froze. They had freeze responses and wouldn't even move in the carousel. So, and that's a whole nother story of separation stress from maternal input. So they kept them in complete darkness, and then during the experiment, and then put them in with the lights only to where they could only see the vertical stripes in the carousel chamber. When they presented them with a visual cliff, as you can see over here on the other side. When they presented them with the visual cliff, the kittens that did not have the active movement did not demonstrate any fear or awareness of that cliff being there. So you and I would probably be able to see that cliff. It was just a glass countertop with a lower floor underneath, so you and I would be able to see that. And the kitten with the active, in the active basket that could see his environment actively could certainly see it too. So he would step very gingerly and be cautious when approaching the cliff. Some kittens wouldn't even approach the cliff. They do this experiment with rats and other things. Some things don't even go across the cliff to the other side. I think that's a rat over there. So you can see how this visual cliff, and so the kittens that only had the passive input could not perceive that cliff. So that was, and then they've done other studies where kittens, when they see only vertical or horizontal lines, then they go and they try to get them to see the opposite kind of lines later, and they have no perception of it. So I have Abigail in here who loves vision, and so she's probably heard about things like this, so it's not you to you. So their binocular vision and their awareness of that potentially falling was somehow disabled, but we're not really sure of the mechanisms on how this happens. Could the blind kittens actually, and my question was, so, and I always tell my students or encourage my students whenever they read research to come up with questions on their own. So of course, and then I always give them an example, and they could be dumb or interesting or not. But my question was, when I look at these studies, is I wonder if the blind kittens could learn to avoid that drop in the future. So, and that could only be maybe through experience, which would be a bad research project, but still, it's a question you could ask. Oh, and then they also do this project with babies and goats. You're going to see a goat theme through this whole thing. I love goats. But babies do this too. They didn't deprive babies of visual stimulus, but in fact, they were just demonstrating that babies can actually show this awareness of the visual cliff at the time. So conditioning during neonatal development is typically done with the intent of benefiting an animal later in life. We use imprinting as a tool to modify animal behavior. So later in the animal's life, for example, biologists can imprint endangered species of birds to help train them on migratory routes, so they can reintroduce them into the wild later. And of course, we use it in more production type animals like horses. So trainers will imprint foals to acclimate them to human touch and to pressure and stimulus in order to help facilitate them to training later in life. However, again, the question you've got to think of is, what kinds of inputs or stimulus or denial of perception are you impeding onto them later? So some complications with captivity is animals living in captivity, and so issues with breeding programs and stereotypic behavior, even disease, under intense health nutrition programs are not uncommon. And due to habitat displacement, more and more species, numbers of animals are going to be dwindling. And it's safe to say that unless we change the way we populate the earth, we're going to need to accommodate more and more animals in some sort of version of captivity to maintain their existence. So much work is left to be done with these interactions between captivity and animal behavior and physiology. So captivity and domestic animals. So we have lots of domestic animals in captivity, but sometimes we see stereotypic behavior in these kinds of issues. So we see bar biting in particular like species like pigs, cribbing and wood chewing in horses, and then specifically we see other types of aggressive behavior in animals like horses. I want to run through some things with just like prenatal the fetal stress in animals, because this is another interesting thing. We think about how stress can affect the animal in its real lifetime, but we don't think about how prenatal stress may affect offspring of the animals or even second generations of animals. So the fetal programming hypothesis was first described by David Barker. In 1989, it suggested the intrauterine environment during critical periods can have an effect on the offspring and the development of different parts of the brain. So this is another area of interest. So it's been suggested that some animal studies that prenatal stress induces changes in the placental phenotype that may have consequences later during pregnancy and fetal development, such as fetal exposure to high levels of cortisol. And so that could impede the growth neurons in the brain as a result of smaller hippocampal sizes and which may result in decreased memory and learning for that animal. Other studies have shown that offspring and sows from pregnancies with increased placental stress were more aggressive. The offspring were more aggressive towards their litters, which is an interesting concept. Maternal stress has a negative impact on reproductive performance, such as litter size and mortality and mortality rates of neonates. Group housing versus individual housing has very conflicting results in different areas, and that those inconsistencies may indicate genetic and environmental interactions competing for influence and homeostasis. So that's an area that maybe we don't understand the pathways quite thoroughly yet. There's effects of prenatal stress on colostrum. So consumption of colostrum is very important, and it provides energy for thermoregulation and passive immunity to neonates. In effect, so you can have, we see a lot of heat stress work in young animals, and during the last 3 weeks of gestation, heat stress is associated with a decreased energy and protein content in colostrum, as well as immune function. And exposure to heat stress and during the dry period was found to reduce both the quality or the quantity of first colostrum and the IgG content. However, little to no work has been done in the effects of physical or psychological stress on colostrum in animals other than rats. So this is something that needs to be done. Prenatal stress and lactation. So this is something that's a little more psychological. However, in humans and rats, it's been reported that neuropeptides such as oxytocin and vasopressin, which participate in important reproductive functions such as parturition and lactation, also provide homeostatic responses to stress. I'm almost done. Including the modulation of the HPA axis. So in adult animals, oxytocin may facilitate both social contact and selective social interactions associated with pair bonding and bonding among maternal and young, and participates in the regulations of parasympathetic functions. So calming effects. Most of the work I just described discussed direct environmental stressors such as heat stress. Not much work has been done with psychological stress or social stress or the mechanisms on how fear or pain can affect production in farm animals or our companion animals. So one particular area of interest that we seem to overlook is prenatal stress and its lasting effects on offspring. And then work documenting the effects of prenatal stress is on learning and memory and the potential increased activity to stimuli later in life. And if you have a horse or something and you know that he spooks at everything, is that a consequence or something? So you can have even the best genetics often lead to problem animals. And it's just, is it just poor training, or is there an environmental issue? And so we have we have a lot of unwanted horses out there. We have lots of animals in the pound. is can we lower those kinds of problems with maintaining or mediating these types of unwanted or stereotypic behaviors in dogs and horses or even cats for these stress or for influences from stress is it happening. And I'd be remiss not to mention one important aspect of animal research that I find very significant but challenging, and that's animal modeling. Is it controversial? Yes. Some of you may disagree with me, but if any of you have ever suffered or had a friend or a loved one who suffered from things like cancer or mental illness or breast cancer or addiction or diabetes, you might feel the same way as I do. And there's always been, if there's a way to find a treatment or a cure for ailments like these, I'm an advocate. But there's a problem in my mind. Rats are a great springboard for animal modeling. However, it's anatomical and physiological differences don't answer all the questions that we need to answer. And so we need to collaborate and develop more animal models that are acceptable to society but work effectively. And so we had an example of animal modeling issue here last week when PETA was picketing the dog work that A&M does. And unfortunately, dogs are a great animal model for muscular dystrophy, but they just happen to be some of the cutest, most beloved dogs in the world, golden retrievers. But did you know another animal that is a model or that suffers from genetically linked muscular dystrophy? Pigs. And there's another one that is maybe a reach, but a nutritionally linked muscular dystrophy. Goats. So is there any way to work with these kind of things and avoid the huge issues? So last slide. Thank you. So there's still a lot of work to be done and understand how the pathways that neurological and genetic and environmental Bermuda Triangle interact with each other and present to us. But the fact is that there's so many eager students here and across the world, I hope, but I know here that that are interested in animal science, that I am not at a loss for things to do. And I love thinking about research and answering questions. But to tell the truth, I'm not that good at it. I don't think I am. I think I'm better at motivating students or inspiring students and building good teams and letting you guys do the work and make yourselves better. And then I'll just live vicariously through you. I just hope you don't forget about me when you're famous and writing or winning the Nobel Prize. So I know I've got a lot of my students out there, and you guys are great. So we could talk about it, but I think I ran out of time. And everybody loves bacon, so that's why pigs are a good model.